I think it's important to understand the context. The name 30 by 30 actually is driven by the environmental groups. So the Center for American Progress published a report in August of 2019 that called for the 30 by 30 plan. And that actually predates that, going back to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity from 1992, where the UN said, hey, all countries should establish goals for how much land is in permanent conservation. And at that time, they were talking about permanently preserved in the natural state, which again is different from what the Biden administration is using as conservation. But that language of 30 by 30 comes from the environmental groups. And the Biden administration basically just parroted what was in that Center for American Progress report in their executive order and in the fact sheet that came out afterwards on January 27th, where they used the same sort of statistics about 1 million species going extinct in the coming decades, a third of U.S. wildlife, every 30 seconds a football field worth of land disappears. They lifted that entirely from the Center for American Progress paper from August 2019. So they're basically just lifting the language. And I think what they saw was that this is really bad, because it really says 30% by 2030. It describes very clearly what they're trying to accomplish. And to me, when I first heard that, I'm like, well, that is crazy. I mean, how are you going to get that done? And so that was my first reaction. And that's why they've since come back and now tried to rename the plan the America the Beautiful plan. Sounds much better, doesn't it? America, who doesn't want America to be beautiful, right? So they realized they made a mistake in allowing it to be framed as 30 by 30. They're trying to change it now to something else, the America the Beautiful plan, but it's still basically the same plan.
Okay, so, exactly, it is being described as a voluntary program where I guess farmers and so forth are allowed, basically paid to keep their lands fallow, or I suppose, right?
Yeah, so there are a number of programs we've had. For example, the Conservation Reserve Program, which has been around since 1985. And that's for farmers and ranchers who want to put their land into conservation, and then the government will reimburse them for that. But those voluntary programs, again, have been around for decades, gotten to 12%. How do they expect to get to 30% with those same voluntary programs? The president does not have constitutional authority to mandate 30% of the land go into conservation. What they've said is they're going to keep using these voluntary programs that are in place because they don't have any choice. They don't have anything else they can do. But they're not going to get to 30% that way in the next 9 years, when over the last several decades they didn't get there. And so that leaves the question, well, how are you going to get to 30%? It's either they're going to fail in their attempt to get to 30%, or they're not telling us how they are going to get to 30%.
So, on the other side, I've heard that, eminent domain basically be discussed as a potential route. And so are there real concerns about this kind of use?
I think eminent domain is unlikely to be used in this context. I think it's more likely what the federal government is going to do is try to extend their regulatory authority over private property to restrict people's private property rights. So, for example, one of the things I've been telling people, when their CRP, that Conservation Reserve Program, when that program on your land comes up for renewal, read the fine print in that new document, because USDA may be putting additional restrictions on you. I talked to one rancher, for example, who, when his CRP agreement came back to him for renewal, they had put language in there to protect the habitat of the swift fox. And he did not know what that meant. He had never seen a swift fox on his property. Asked USDA, what does this mean? And USDA could not tell him what he had to do to protect the habitat of the swift fox. He was concerned enough by that, he didn't re-up his CRP land because he didn't want to commit to something that they couldn't tell him what he had to do. Pretty straightforward, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what one of the things we're telling people is read the fine print on your documents. I think another way they're going to try and do it is through permanent easements, which is really getting landowners to voluntarily agree to put their land in permanent conservation. And we want landowners to know that if you do that, you can't get it back. It's a one-way street, and you've permanently restricted your land, which means you've given up your private property rights. Now, again, as private landowners, they can do that, but we want them to be aware of all the rules when they get involved with that. And we also want counties to know that they can reject or approve those permanent easements if they've set up the structure to review those in an objective way. So that's also part of the education process that we're going around the state telling people about.
So we both have had some education in biology in our lives, as I've learned on your side. how do you perceive the current situation? Like, for example, is there some kind of environmental crisis? Is there, I mean, I'm not just talking about climate. Is there biodiversity, pollution? There's a whole series of realms where there are issues being described when it comes to environment. How do you see this?
Conservation is a good thing. Our farmers and ranchers were the original conservationists because they wanted to pass on the family farm or ranch to the next generation. So they took care of the land and their animals so they could do that. And in fact, Nebraska's, according to U.S. News and World Report, Nebraska has the 6th best natural environment of any state in the country. Our beef producers, for example, have worked along with other national beef producers to be able to increase production of beef by 66% since the 1960s, while reducing their carbon footprint by 40%. Our Ogallala Aquifer, which is what underlies our state. It's how we are the largest irrigated state in the country. We tap into the Ogallala Aquifer to do that. But we put a system of water management in place 50 years ago to do that. And so our Ogallala Aquifer is within 1 foot of where it was in the 1950s. So we here in Nebraska, we do a good job of promoting conservation and taking care of the land. Nobody cares more about it than we do. We don't need the federal government to come in here and apply a one-size-fits-all answer to how we can continue to practice good conservation, because we're already doing it here in Nebraska. So conservation is a good thing. What they're talking about with this 30 by 30 plan would be devastating to our small towns and rural communities. And in fact, that's part of the problem with this is people in urban areas, who are the primary ones proposing this, are not going to pay the price. Our rural folks will pay the price for this. Because if you were to take, again, Nebraska being 97% privately owned, and set 30% of that into conservation and restrict it, say, from agricultural use. Now you've taken away 30% of the land that was helping to pay property taxes that support schools and roads and all those other things that property taxes pay for. That means everybody else's property taxes are going to have to go up because you've taken that much land off the tax rolls. And then the land that's remaining for agricultural purposes will cost more because it's just law of supply and demand, right? If you've got a good and you've got less of it, the price goes up. So land will go up, which will also drive up property taxes. And that will also make the farmers and ranchers have more pressure as far as production for the crops we grow or the animals we raise, and that will ultimately drive up the cost of food. So there's all sorts of consequences the Biden administration either hasn't considered or isn't willing to talk about with this big proposal to do 30% of the land in the United States into conservation. And again, we're talking about enough land to fill up 9 states in Nebraska. It's a huge amount of land they're talking about. And for states like Nebraska and all the states in the Midwest, this is going to be a huge issue for small towns and rural communities.